Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this very special conversation. Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet and the Bengal Club Library Committee is very happy to present this special event, Brunch with Amitav Ghosh. Sahitya Academy winner and Padma Shri Amitav Ghosh is the first English language writer to win the Gyanpith Award. He is the author of several acclaimed novels, including The Hungry Tide, The Great Derangement, Gun Island, and most recently, The Nutmeg Curse. His latest book, The Living Mountain, is due to be officially released on May 12th, but we are lucky that he is here with us today to talk about this new book. And the books are also available. You can purchase them. They are not officially released, but since Mr. Ghosh is here with us today, we've managed to arrange a few copies of the book. He's been a long friend of the literary meet, and we are very, very happy to have him here with us today. He'll be in conversation with Festival Director Malvika Banerjee. I would now like to invite Mr. Ghosh and Malvika on stage, please.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me at the back? Can you hear me now? Okay, I think we'll have to just speak slightly louder than we normally do. So good morning, friends, and good morning, Amitav. Thank you for sparing time in a very quick and rushed visit to Kolkata for this double header of sorts. So how do you feel being back here post-pandemic?
Well, it's a very strange feeling, because my mother died at the height of the pandemic in 2020, in August 2020, and I couldn't come, so my poor sister had to manage the whole thing, my sister and my niece. So it was really, I mean, that was really a kind of pandemic trauma, you know, not being able to come, being stuck over there. But anyway, so this is the first time I've actually been able to come back. Because twice, I came actually in 2021, but I couldn't get past Goa. Because every time I came, suddenly the numbers would shoot up over here, and I had to go back.
And every time you went back, it shot up there.
Yes. Yes, so it's been a long, it's been a long, long journey, yes.
Yes. Well, I mean, if it was a very dark cloud, so I don't know about silver linings, but if there was one, it is that you were very productive, and we actually had 3 books: Jungle Nama, then The Nutmeg's Curse, and after that, The Living Mountain. So we did all these sessions online, not The Living Mountain, and it's wonderful to have you live and in front of us. I believe the new term is IRL, in real life. So it's wonderful to welcome you back, IRL.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be doing this event for The Living Mountain. It's the first, so it's kind of like a book release.
Yes. So I was wanting to just roll back a little and start with The Nutmeg's Curse. So we've had the privilege of speaking about each of your books at the Kolkata Literary Meet. So, and the books are inextricably linked in many ways. So we'll start briefly with The Nutmeg's Curse and then perhaps segue into The Living Mountain as we go along. So the Nutmeg's Curse, what took you to this island, this tiny little island, which is part of a group of islands where the nutmeg is found? Our beloved Mace is Javitri and Jaifal, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
Yes. Well, what happened was the Indonesian Ministry of Culture, they invited me to tour in Indonesia. And I love Indonesia. I've traveled a lot in Indonesia. I honestly think Indonesia is just about the most interesting country in the world. Um, and the one part of Indonesia I hadn't been to was the Spice Islands, because that is Maluku, you know. Because Maluku's actually not been accessible for a long time. They had these communal riots, actually, starting around about 2000, and you know, clashes between Christians and Muslims, and they were really bad, you know, in Ambon and many places like that. So, but by 2012, they had started opening up a bit. And in 2016, when they asked me, I said, well, I would like to go to these Spice Islands. So they said, fine. And my God, I mean, they did it on such a grand scale. I mean, they sent like advance parties, and I was traveling with like a dozen people in my entourage. So it was a kind of extraordinary experience. But then, so I ended up in the, you know, I went to Ternate and Tidore, which are the islands that were the islands of the clove, the original islands of the clove. And then I went to the Banda Islands. And, you know, I knew something about the history of these spices, but I didn't know much. And it was, in a sense, you know, that's the interesting thing about writing travelogues, if you like, you know. That is, the land teaches you, you know, in some strange way. And it was while I was there that really the enormity of what had happened on these islands really dawned on me, you know. I mean that, so what happened is that in 1621, so the Banda Islands, I mean, they're tiny, tiny islands. I mean, the biggest of them, you can like, is like what, a few miles long, you know. You can walk across the whole island in a day. So there are like 5 islands, and actually, you know, they're the rim of a caldera, that is a sunken volcano. And the volcano is still active, and it's sort of constantly spewing in the background. So these islands, tiny as they are, because they had the nutmeg tree, and the nutmeg tree produces both the nutmeg and mace. Mace is just the outer covering of the nutmeg. So the people, the Bandanese people, historically tiny group, maybe about 15,000 people, but they were very prosperous, and they were a very enterprising trading community. They sort of ranged across the Indian Ocean, and the islands drew people from all around the Indian Ocean, you know, Chinese, Arabs, Indians, Gujaratis. So, so they were a very prosperous people because, you know, way back, even, you know, before the Common Era, nutmegs were circulating in Europe. In the Middle Ages, just a handful of nutmegs could buy you a house in Europe, you know, or a ship. I mean, their price was just absolutely phenomenal. So, in fact, you know, we always think that the Portuguese came looking for India, but they really actually went looking for the islands of, they really went looking for the Spice Islands, you know. And actually, they reached the Spice Islands within 12 years of reaching India. And the Europeans wanted, right from the start, to impose monopolies on these spices, you know, trade monopolies. And that was not the way that trade happened in the Indian Ocean, you know. So the Dutch turned up in the Banda Islands in 1600, actually. And the moment their volcano saw the Dutch, it exploded, which it did at regular intervals when it saw Dutch ships. Anyway, so the Dutch arrived there, and they tried to impose, again, a treaty, a monopoly treaty. Of course, the Bandanese resisted. So in 1621, the Dutch Governor General, a man called Jan Pietersen Koen, he took a fleet, you know, of ships to the Banda Islands and basically murdered all the Bandanese. Murdered a large number, enslaved the rest, and you know, starved the others to death. A few managed to escape, and actually there are now, you know, hamlets and villages on other islands which are traced back to the Bandanese diaspora. But, so it's such a ghastly story if you think about it, that, in every civilization there's always been this idea of a tree of life, and the life-giving fruit, if you like. And it was for them, the tree of prosperity. But eventually, it turned into the most dreadful curse. I mean, they were just eliminated. And so they were one of the first examples of the resource curse, And I was just talking with Rudra here. So what the Dutch had in mind is that after they had eliminated the Bandanese, they put into place this version of racialized capitalism. They give the land to basically white planters, and then they ship in all these slaves, and most of the slaves were actually from India. So they started operating this plantation system over there. And it's actually quite similar, I mean, except for the mass killings, it's quite similar to the way the tea industry starts in India.
So the amazing part of this uncanny, you've called it an uncanny intersection between your circumstances in Brooklyn, which apparently also has Dutch history attached to it, and your investigation and studying this whole incident happened, 399 years later during the pandemic. So in many ways, this book, right through, you kind of chronicle the story of the Dutch, and then from there you're going to other forms of colonization. But there is an underlying thread of the pandemic. So how did you feel writing this book? You've mentioned, as you just mentioned, your mother passed away, you were unable to come. So you'd often wondered how, plantation workers would be cut away from their families. And there are echoes of the past and present right through this book. So how would you connect the pandemic and, all that we've been through these last 2 years to the after effects of climate change?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, I had been traveling a lot before even in February of 2020, I was in California. Then I came back to Brooklyn. I think it was the 1st or 2nd of March. And my wife was then in Virginia because her parents her mother had died in January and her father was very sick. So she was away. And I was literally all on my own, except that my son and his partner live, in a part of our house. But there I was, and it was a very strange, very, very strange experience, because at that moment, in mid-March, Brooklyn was absolutely the epicenter of of the pandemic. And my house is just a 10-minute walk to the Brooklyn Hospital, where literally they brought in these refrigerated trucks to store the bodies, So it was a strange, uncanny, eerie feeling, because suddenly the streets of Brooklyn were completely empty. And all we would hear all day long were these ambulances, thundering down. It was just so strange. And I had just finished Jungle Nama, just started working on this book, and I became obsessed with this one book published in the late 19th century, which describes, in fact, the Banda genocide in great detail. But the book is in Dutch, and I don't read Dutch. So what I somehow managed to find a PDF of the Dutch of this book. And I downloaded it, and I would keep staring at it, and I would keep thinking, this book has secrets, I want to know, And it's something which really obsesses me, because a long time ago, I actually learned a very obscure language called Judeo-Arabic to write a book called In an Antique Land. So I'm not one to be defeated by languages. Unfortunately, now we have Google Translate. So what I did literally was that I would copy sections of this Dutch text and feed it into into Google Translate. And, in that way, I started sort of unlocking, if you like, the mystery of this thing. But it was such a strange thing, really, because it was this intersection of these two non-human entities, on the one hand, the internet, and the coronavirus, both operating at a global scale, but together they came together to, as it were, open a window for me, And it was strange, especially because, Brooklyn is Breukelen. It was originally a Dutch colony, and, New York was New Amsterdam. And actually, it was New York passed into British hands at exactly the time that Calcutta was founded in the 1660s. So it's, so actually the curious thing is the Banda Islands are one end of the Dutch Empire, and the other end is actually New Amsterdam, So these techniques of mass slaughter, which they brought to the Banda Islands, were actually, they learnt these techniques actually in the Americas, where at the same time they were massacring Native Americans, on this vast scale. And I think it's really that enabled, if you like, this mass slaughter in the Bandas.
So you've then moved with the nutmeg from, the genocide. It can't be called anything else in the Banda Islands, to what happened, what you call terraforming. And there's an interesting part about the buffalo and the Native American, and how they were almost symbiotic in their existence, and how all of that was exterminated by settlers. So, the term terraforming, I will admit to not having thought or heard of it before I read this book. So I'm sure there are several others who would, the deep relationship between what we today call climate change and what happened in the form of terraforming, if you can just talk us through that.
Sure. So, terraforming is a term that will be familiar to anyone who reads science fiction. Because the idea is that, well, like for example, what Elon Musk wants to do. He wants to go to Mars and transform it into a habitable place for human beings. But so the term terraforming actually came into use in the 1940s. There was an American science fiction writer who invented it. So terra is earth and forming is, earth forming, as it were. But the idea goes back a lot further than that, because H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds is basically based on the same premise. That is, an alien race comes to the earth and wants to exterminate all earthlings and then adapt the planet for their own use. But that idea was completely borrowed. And in fact, H.G. Wells's idea came from Tasmanian history, where the British had literally done this. They exterminated all the Tasmanians and then adapted Tasmania for their own use. So, so this idea of terraforming actually has a very long history in colonialism. We think of colonialism as only a sort of process of domination over other humans. But what is actually very interesting and very distinctive about New World colonization is the use of non-human entities, non-human entities like disease, non-human entities like livestock. One of the most important elements of the colonization of the Americas was their deployment of livestock, because wherever they introduced, pigs and cows, essentially the pigs and cows were the outliers. They would invade Native American settlements, and they would make Native American livelihood impossible, because Native Americans depended on forests, on free-flowing rivers, and so on. So this idea of terraforming through the use of livestock, through the use of dams, deforestation, and so on, was a very important aspect of colonization. And it's what makes that kind of colonization very different from the sort of colonization that we experienced. Because here, terraforming was actually limited to certain areas. I would say to the tea plantations of Assam, if you like. But also, the one part of India that is really most extensively terraformed is Bombay. Because Bombay, was 6 islands. And already starting in the late 18th century, they started filling in these islands, and making it into this kind of peninsula. The curious thing is, if you look now at the sort of continuities of of this history with the present planetary crisis, it's kind of almost uncanny, really, because what does Bolsonaro? I mean, the Amazon is our last hope. It's the world's greatest carbon sink. And what does Bolsonaro want to do to it? He wants to take it all down, replace it basically with a monoculture of soya. And this monoculture of soya is not because they want to grow soya, it's because they want to grow cattle. So that's the whole point of it. They just want to take down the Amazon and create these incredible cattle farms, So, you see that entire colonial logic playing out again, in real time in our era, with what is almost certainly going to be catastrophic consequences for the world, because the destruction of forests in Brazil has escalated at a pace that nobody had expected. These settlers have been setting wildfires in the Amazon, and even during the pandemic, this strange sort of North American, this strange American form of colonization through disease. So disease, the indigenous populations of the Amazon were disproportionately hit by COVID.
You mentioned, this infected blanket.
Yeah.
The missionaries just gave out these blankets that were infected from those who had died to other communities to ensure that all of them were wiped out.
Yeah, so, this is...
That sounds particularly evil somehow.
It's completely evil, but all of it is evil. Because, so within the European sort of way of thinking, they would say that disease is a non-human entity, and it's in nature, and nature follows its own laws. But of course, Native Americans never accepted that. They said that you are weaponizing disease, which is in fact what they were doing. They were weaponizing disease in multiple ways. That is, they were giving out these blankets and finding ways to infect people, but also herding Native Americans into camps, where the disease would spread very rapidly. So they were absolutely weaponizing disease in these multiple ways. But really, what is interesting about this, what is kind of just horrendous about it, is that they became very expert in this form of biopolitical warfare, where they actually weaponize non-human entities of various kinds and deploy it against other populations, which is what they did to China with Indian opium. With opium grown in Bihar and eastern UP and in the Malwa region, and exporting this on a scale unimaginable scale to China. And until recent times, until the 1920s and 30s, they were pushing opium on China in this way, and at the same time claiming that they were like the great saviors of the world and so on. And we still are speaking under their shadow, where they brought, catastrophe upon the world.
I couldn't bring myself to put a backdrop and cover him. So, I wanted to talk about the literature, but before that, I just saw a short clip which you had once tweeted out, where this gentleman from California kept calling you a climate activist during the interview. I think it was for the Nutmeg curse. So typically climate change, narratives are all about the future and about how science will solve it. And you have, for the last 6-7 years, or perhaps the turning point was the Hungry Tide, you've always said the solutions can't lie merely in finding a scientific or technological solution. So the importance of these stories, you know, both your books, one is a fable of our times and the other one is Parables of a Planet in Crisis. So how important are remembering these stories which you mention in the Nutmeg Curse, and then we'll go into the next book.
Yeah, I mean, see, there's a complete difference, an absolute gap between the way in which the planetary crisis is perceived in the West and the way that it's perceived in the South. Because in the global South, I mean, because if you talk to any Westerner about what is this crisis, they'll say, oh, it's all about technology, it's all about technological solutions, it's all about, reducing your carbon footprint and finding ways to do it. Now, if you talk to anyone in the global South, you'll get a completely different answer. And, the Malaccas are a very good example of that because, in this island, Ternate, which was the home of the clove forever. And they have a dynasty of sultans that's still extant, I mean, since the 12th century. And I actually met the present incumbent. And a terrible thing is happening in Ternate. I mean, because of climate change, their clove trees are disappearing. They're dying, literally dying, And I asked many people there, including this sultan. I mean, I just asked experimentally because it's kind of interesting to hear the answers. I said, look, your clove trees are dying. This is your great, this is your tree of life. Aren't you worried? Don't you want to, don't you want to shrink your carbon footprint? And the first thing they answer is always, why should we shrink it? Our carbon footprint is small anyway, per capita. It's they who should shrink their carbon footprint because they got rich at our expense when we were weak and poor. Why should we do anything? It's the responsibility is on them. So you see, immediately, this crisis is perceived as a geopolitical crisis. A crisis of inequity, of geopolitics. It's not seen at all in this technological frame. And I think, I go on harping about that, but I really don't think Westerners understand this at all, because they're just not able to understand it. It's a way of...
So, so these meets like COP26 or even Davos, do you have any hope from them, because they somehow end in a sense of the solutions being intractable because of these two perspectives, one of the global South saying it's the problem was aggravated by the settlements and the colonizers. So do you see these, they are important, but do you see any solution coming from such forums?
I was always very skeptical of the COP process, and now it's perfectly clear that it's just nonsense. I mean, this last COP26 in Glasgow, what happened? The three of the most important players in the world boycotted it. Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro literally thumbed his nose at it, because he was on holiday in Italy at the time, I mean, you can't have any climate solution. I mean, that kind of solution if you don't have these three players on board, All the rest is, I mean, just talk. I mean, it's just a yak. And in fact, what were they able to decide on? I mean, it's, these stupid concepts like net zero, which actually mean nothing, So anyone can say, oh yes, I'll be net zero by 2025 or whatever. And it doesn't mean anything. No one can hold you to that because nobody even knows what actually it means, So besides that, the entire system of international politics, if you like, has completely broken down. We have to understand this. This COP26 made it clear. This war in Ukraine has made it even more clear. Look, you can't put half the world under sanctions for various reasons and then expect them to cooperate on something like this. How does that work? You impose punitive sanctions upon, China, Russia, Iran, and then you expect that they're going to sort of come along with you for this ride? Of course not. You know, so this entire process has just catastrophically collapsed. We have to understand that really the only people who were sort of strutting about at COP26 were really, the old Anglosphere, the old colonial Anglosphere. And the ways in which they fixed this whole thing, I mean, just like the British, during the days of the opium trade, whenever there was any talk of controlling the opium trade, they would always send some Indian bureaucrat, who would come up with some fancy arguments. Oh, the Indian peasant will starve if you stop the opium trade. The same way, how cleverly Boris Johnson put up an Indian figurehead. It's so strange to see these patterns repeat, So, if anything, I would say this entire COP26 process, or this entire process of negotiations on climate change, is eerily, uncannily similar to the processes of through which Anglo settlers negotiated treaties with Native Americans. They would set up a treaty, and then the moment it came time to implement it, they would say, no, we'll change this treaty into that. So just like Kyoto, they did it. They did it again for the Paris Agreement. It's uncannily similar.
The hope that is proffered is there is some enlightenment and respect that is now being gained by what is called TEK, indigenous knowledge of how to deal with climate change, but that too fills you with some skepticism.
Yes, intense skepticism, sorry. Yeah, so there is this talk of TEK and so on, and, the whole, that's called traditional ecological knowledge. So now they've suddenly realized that, yes, actually, the native people knew better. So they're trying to sort of revive, let's say, a forest burning, which they had absolutely stamped out for like more than 100 years because that was what German forestry told them. Now it turns out that in Australia as well as in North America, the native people actually knew better. But by this time, they've exterminated so many native people that hardly anybody remembers those techniques, And in any case, those techniques are not like technologies, Those techniques are rooted in so many kinds of stories, in mythologies, So, you can't revive that technique just as technique. You have to revive the entire culture, Just as, cultivation in India is not just you go and plow up the soil. There are various sorts of rites and things that you do, which are closely interconnected with that whole process. So, I think, this TEK is just another form of appropriation, And I don't think that, I'm sorry to say, I don't think that there's much hope to be had there.
So which brings us to the other book we are discussing today, The Living Mountain. It's short, the subtitle is A Fable of Our Times. It's a story about the world in a way, and is like a companion piece, if I may venture to add, to the Nutmeg's Curse. So how did The Living Mountain come to life?
Well, actually what happened, I had written something along those lines, way back, I think 10 years ago, and I read it out in Singapore, and in fact, they made a play out of it in Singapore. But then I just put it aside. And then, a friend of mine who's a sort of leading climate expert, she was, doing this sort of anthology of writing on the Anthropocene. And most of the people who are writing for it are, like the top scientists and so on. So she asked me, and I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? And I couldn't think of anything except this story, So I rewrote it. I sort of worked on it and so on. So it's going to be a part of that collection, which is coming out from CUP. That's the Cambridge University Press. But I also happened to send the story to my editor at HarperCollins, and he loved it and said he wanted to do it as a book. So here it is.
So you mentioned that while you were giving this up as part of a set of articles and talks on climate change, you were up against a lot of scientists and experts. So how important is it for stories to tell the story of climate change? How important is it for us to frame the story of climate change against the science of it?
I think it's very, very important. And, the curious thing is, I mean, my climate scientist friends, they're actually really wonderful people and very humble and hardworking and really dedicated to this. And they constantly say, you have to tell the story. But I don't think they really understand what the story is. I mean, they don't really understand the story themselves. And and they don't understand storytelling either. So, I mean, their story of climate change is one of going off to Mars, quite often. And my story is quite a different story, that Mars is already here.
So, the book ends with us presuming that we are going to protect nature from here on. The high-minded, modern thinking scientist feels that nature has to be protected from man. And you end by saying, have you learnt nothing? So is that something, we learned in the city a couple of years ago through the Ampan, and are we going to learn that lesson through many such climate events and catastrophes? Is there any good news?
Well, something I take as a very positive development is that I think, all those old assumptions on which modernity was built, on which a certain kind of modernity was built, are actually visibly crumbling, And you see signs of that everywhere. For example, the whole idea, I mean, for, let's say, 200 years, colonialists basically exterminated anyone who thought that the land was alive. Can you imagine that in America, which is founded on ideas of religious freedom, in fact, the only people who weren't allowed to practice their religion was Native Americans, because their religion was founded around earth beliefs. But now, suddenly we see that, there's been a very important anti-fossil fuel movement in North America, which is known as the No Dakota Pipeline movement. And this movement, which is led mainly by indigenous women, in fact, has been extraordinarily effective. It's been one of the very few movements that's actually managed to hold off a pipeline. And I think, and this entire movement is not a traditional political movement at all. It's built around ideas of sacrality and the sacredness of the earth and the sacredness of the water. And that's what's given it this incredible vitality. And I think, even the Occupy movement of 2012 was very much built around ideas of, trying to model different ways of living, different kinds of lives. And we have that here as well. I mean, the Adivasis in Niyamgiri managed to resist, mining interests. And what was more, the Supreme Court recognized the sacrality of mountains. Similarly, in New Zealand, their Supreme Court has recognized the personhood of a river. And just imagine, I mean, these are sort of old white guy judges, I mean, for them, the idea that they're descended from a river must be absurd in personal life, yet they're willing to give it judicial recognition. In Iceland, a glacier has been given funerary rights. So I do think that we are seeing the breakdown of a certain kind of mechanistic mindset, that came with this whole colonial enterprise. But, so we see all sorts of movements of this kind arising. But again, one shouldn't be Pollyanna-ish. I mean, here in India, today, we have completely adopted these settler colonial strategies of so-called development. I mean, even though the Niyamgiri Adivasis managed to gain a victory or two, look what's happening now in Hasdeo, Arand, and so on. These last stretches of primary forest are being opened up to mining industries, you know. So, one can't be Pollyanna-ish, but as you said, one must look for whatever good news there is, because frankly, there's very, very little. And if you ask me, the most promising sign is that it's now clear that extraterrestrials actually have been visiting the Earth for a long time. So, I mean, the American Defense Department has said so. So maybe they'll save us.
So, now that you're mentioning ETs and, outer space life, the Nutmeg curse, just to go back, the stories that we can't explain, coincidences, what we call miracles, you mentioned, how do you pronounce it, shaman?
Yes, shaman.
Shaman. So a shaman said, the bees spoke to him and said that, they are endangered. Even I have to admit, when I read that, I did kind of roll my eyes. So how do you deal with this? What we can't explain scientifically, we do not take seriously. How does that mindset break?
I don't know if that mindset can break. Look, the human consciousness is a very wide spectrum. I mean, if you take the old Bandanese, for them, they were traders at one level, so the nutmegs were a trade commodity, which they traded with other people. At the same time, it was also something more, so that they sang songs about the nutmeg. The nutmeg was a kind of spirit being for them as well. So, the human consciousness ranges over a very wide set of things. So I don't expect that, a farmer who's plowing his land is at one level doing something very practical. At the same time, when he prays to his plow, he is doing something else altogether, and both those consciousnesses can coexist. And I think the terrible thing is that, what has happened with the rise of a certain sort of technological age is that our tools are no longer our tools. We have become, as it were, the tools of our tools. They now dictate to us. I mean, if you try to think of the idea of, let's say, shutting down the global internet, is it even possible? I mean, would the internet allow itself to be shut down? So it's obviously already attained some form of agency, which we cannot override anymore. But, that other aspect of human existence was something that in the past was addressed in literature, most of all. And that is what we have lost today, I think. Literature can no longer give voice, if you like, to the uncanny, to the non-human. And you literally cannot give voice to the non-human without accepting the notion of the uncanny.
Okay, before we open it out, since you mentioned literature, you've spoken about, the Victorian authors and, in memoriam, there's this poem which Ronald Reagan quoted from, all of which in many ways unconsciously almost speak about mastering nature. So once again, how important is it to the Lord of the Flies, where these boys stuck on an island turn against each other, and then you mention a real incident in Tonga where that absolutely did not happen. So you call to question the heart of darkness as well. So I found that part of the book very interesting too, the way you've broken down these things, and also mentioned the Swedish author Lindqvist,
yes.
who wrote about Conrad in particular. So is it important to reread these books that are part of our curriculum even in India?
It's very important, I think, because, Lord of the Flies was a text that I had to read in school, a long time ago. And actually, if you think about it, what is the idea there? This whole idea of, that to be human, you have to have this huge pressure from above, And if that pressure is taken away, you become savage in the sense of wanting to kill each other and harm each other and so on. But these are not realities. In fact, human beings cooperate. And that's the other aspect of ourselves. And, maybe if a bunch of English schoolboys was abandoned on an island, they would actually, because they have this cult of individualism and selfishness and so on, that they would kill each other. But, these Tongans, a bunch of young Tongans actually went through this experience, their boat was wrecked, they ended up on an island, and they were just teenagers. And they worked out this elaborate system of looking after each other, of growing stuff and sharing stuff. And it wasn't at all like the Lord of the Flies, So there are many possibilities within human beings, This whole sort of discipline of economics has been built upon this idea of selfishness, But as Elinor Ostrom, she also won the Nobel Prize for Economics, and she's shown that, every critical situation, in fact, traditional cultures always develop forms of sharing, sharing of the commons and so on. I mean, just imagine that today in California, which is the home of, selfish individualism and a certain kind of modernity, now they have water rationing, actually quite draconian water rationing. And they're not, rising up in arms. They're dealing with it. So human beings can do that.
Well, on that rare note of hope from Amitav, can we have some questions? There's one right at the back, one young gentleman. You shout. Saying, if there is no hope, what is the point of what? What is the point?
I see what you're saying. See, this idea of hope, it's predicated on a certain kind of, on a foundational sort of belief of modernity, which is progress. So this idea of hope and progress, that things will always get better and better and better, they're sort of very intricately tied. But that is actually a very sort of Western idea, which I think everyone's now absorbed. But when I was a child growing up, we didn't always expect things would get better and better. And I don't think that's in any sense, even within Catholicism, there's no sense in which people expect continual progress. In Catholicism, history is seen as a labyrinth, in which you sort of accidentally bump into all sorts of problems. So nowhere in the human condition has it ever been said that things will always get better and better. And yet we carry on because, if you like, it's our duty. It's our karma, And within that duty, within that karma, we actually find consolations. So that things are getting worse is not entirely a bad thing. And I'm sure you've seen within the pandemic, it helps you throw out all the waste and the mess in your lives, It helps you throw out the people who are not essential to you, all the other stuff that's not essential to you. It makes you rethink the fundamentals. So, I think one shouldn't think about it as hope or despair. You should think of it as duty. You live because you have to, and in that you discover all sorts of consolations.
Okay, Rudra. There is a mic.
Very, very interesting. And when you were talking about tea and opium, I was also thinking of, we're talking about Assam, but also in UP and Bihar. Both those products brought in to industrial scale and manufactured and exported. Unlike tea, those are no longer consumed in the scale that it used to. And during the, I go to Eastern UP a lot, and I see opium bungalows. Cornwallis died, after coming to India. And those are very poor parts, despite being, when a trade comes in and then when it goes out, like whatever has happened to an extent to tea, gone to Africa and other places. And, the effect it leaves on the community with opium, indigo, and tea. Can you talk about that?
Sure, absolutely. In fact, I'm writing a book about it right now. I think opium is very much the resource curse. Because the British basically started enforcing a pattern of opium cultivation in Purvanchal. And Purvanchal, that is Bihar and eastern UP, if we think back in our history, these are the richest parts of the Indian subcontinent. I mean, it's where it's the heartland of Indian civilization. And it continued to be so until the 18th century. Under colonialism, when they imposed this system, it's a strange thing, my books, the Ibis trilogy, actually have created, it's led to a lot of new research on opium. So I'm now going back to that new research. And it's very interesting, there was no complete history of the opium department, which ran this mini empire, in Purvanchal. And what this historian, he's actually an Austrian historian called Ralph Bauer, what he shows us is that it was a completely draconian system, It wasn't a plantation, but it wasn't a plantation only because it was too big. It was a gigantic system enforced by the state, So there was incredible surveillance. Basically, the entire population was criminalized. And these peasants who are producing this opium are producing it below cost, So they're actually incurring debts in order to produce this opium. This opium which is making fantastic fortunes for people elsewhere. For, of course, a lot of the British merchants, but also for N number of American merchants. Actually, that's the really interesting part, the degree to which American capitalism is built on Indian opium. All these major families, for example, the Delanos, the Coolidges, so many of the most important presidential, FDR's grandfather was one of the biggest opium merchants in China. So, the degree to which opium underwrote British capitalism and Indian capitalism. Virtually every major industrial house in Western India at some point was dealing with opium. That's where they basically made their money from. Their seed capital came from that. So, but for the peasant, it was an absolute, again, a resource curse. And I think you can literally trace the poverty of not just Purvanchal, but I will also say Eastern India to this opium trade. Because in the 19th century, opium was the biggest business in Calcutta, by far. It was the major center for the exporting of opium through, the opium department because they held their auctions here. But basically, local people were not allowed to participate. It was either expatriate Westerners or expatriate people from Western India because they were growing their own opium, so they had a lot of experience with it. And actually, that's what led to the in-migration, if you like, of people from Western India into Calcutta on a large scale. So it's a very interesting thing, the way that opium is actually knit into the fabric of our economy, our history, and yet it's never really sort of addressed at all. And you say that opium is consumed. See, again, this is really the interesting thing. I mean, the British deployed, and even before them, the Dutch, deployed the opium poppy literally as a kind of biopolitical weapon, against the people of Southeast Asia and the people of China. But they thought that they were in control, but they were never in control. It's the poppy that's in control. And today, in fact, opium is just about the world's largest industry. It runs everything. I mean, what defeated the US and Afghanistan? It was basically the opium poppy, And today it's ineradicable. it's completely seized all our populations. I mean, in America, they've been fighting heroin for like decades. There's more heroin consumed today in America than ever before. You know, the American Supreme Court passed a judgment against the Sackler family for their prescription opioids. But prescription opioid death has been rising ever since, even after the banning of the Sackler family. So, you know, even more than climate change, actually, what is really kind of uncanny, if you see it, is the complete hold that the opium poppy has established upon human beings. We will never be able to, and today in India, we have a crisis of unprecedented proportions, you know, especially in the Punjab. You know, I mean, you will have noticed that in the last few elections in the Punjab, heroin addiction was a major issue. And this thing is so dangerous, you know, especially the next level, fentanyl. You can die if you touch it. You know, so this is the thing about the opium poppy, that unlike synthetic substances, it has this uncanny ability to increase its power and its addictiveness, you know. So, you know, this is something to be very, very scared of, because I don't think that the only country that was able to battle mass opium addiction was China. I don't think any country anywhere is ever going to be able to battle it again.
I think there's a question from Shukantuda, yes.
Amitav, I wanted to take you up on your point that there was relatively little terraforming during colonial times in India. Now, I think there was a great deal, and the crucial thing is it's not a sort of a hived-off historical process. It's continuing and worsening down to the present day. See, for instance, the matter of plantations, you mentioned the tea plantations, but the creation of plantations is going on to the present day and increasing, partly for compensation, you know, this kind of compensatory tree planting that is supposed to be carried out for the environmental damage caused by industry. Much of it is actually ensuring further corporate profits by creating plantations, replacing a complete varied biosphere by monoculture. Okay, this is a very critical point that I think the nation needs to engage with. The other thing is that, you know, in British times and since, huge tracts of forest land were cleared for agriculture. That is the basis, for instance, of Biopolitical work Arunduk. See, it's not just nostalgia for a vanishing forest. The narrator is actually there as the key agent who's making the forest vanish. He's employed by a corporation which is clearing the forests, creating agricultural land, and importing people to settle on the land. Okay? And that process is continuing through mining on a huge scale and through urbanization. You mentioned Bombay, but it's not just Bombay and Mumbai. It is above all maybe our city, Kolkata, which has been drastically terraformed through its history. I mean, this was entirely marshland, wetland. Okay? And now gradually that wetland has been pushed back to, well, but it's still there, within a few kilometers of where we are sitting today. And so the entire ecological kind of thrust of this entire region is being pushed further and further back into a smaller and smaller territory. And when the current wetlands disappear, as it is doing on a huge scale every day, then it's a question of how the city will survive. And in various ways, there are similar problems elsewhere with the rivers, the waterways in Chennai, with the lakes in Bengaluru. So I think there's this tremendous amount of terraforming that in both colonial times and down to this day is increasing.
I agree with you, but I think there is a difference between the terraforming of the Americas and the terraforming that we saw in India. See, in the Americas, the whole idea was that they're recreating Europe. You know, that they're recreating a European landscape in a completely different continent, in a completely different kind of environment. I don't think that they were trying to do that in the same way here. So that I think if you were a 17th century person and you came to, let's say Madhya Pradesh or wherever, the terrain would not be unrecognizable, you know. Whereas if you were a 17th century person and you went to New England, the terrain would be completely unrecognizable. I mean, the terrain is absolutely now Europeanized in a way that hasn't happened here to that degree. So that's the point that I'm trying to make. The second thing is that, you know, that terraforming is a part of a process of biopolitical warfare. Whereas colonial wars in India were not biopolitical in the same sense. You know, basically it was humans fighting humans, you know, with swords and stuff. Whereas in the Americas, they were constantly using, you know, non-human entities, you know, as weapons. So those are the two different points I would make. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole scale of what is happening today in India, it's just beyond imagining, really.
There's a question right at the back.
Hello, sir. Hello, sir.
Hi.
The Nutmeg curse compared to the Kohinoor's curse. Your comments on that?
Well, I think it's quite similar. I mean,
I was going to ask, is it the same curse?
no, it's a different curse.
So what is the difference?
Well, I mean, the Kohinoor's curse only affected a few families, whereas...
Okay, anything else? Yeah.
From the writing perspective, so if I would say that on what basis, like, how do you choose your topics? Like, what are the thoughts that come to your head when you choose what to write about a novel, or how do you approach your research? I would like to know from a writing perspective.
Well, I wish I could explain that. I don't think one can, but when you get ideas about something that you want to write, my first step is to sort of really find out everything I can about it. So I do a lot of research. I like to travel to all the places I'm writing about. And that for me is one of the most fulfilling aspects of writing.
We have time for just one more question. Yes, there's the lady at the back.
Yeah, my question is really taking a step back, and you know, through many of your books and what you've been talking about, the idea of us and them, that continues very strongly over the millennia, really. So we're talking about, let's say, the conquerors and the colonized, or the West and the East, or the West and the global South, and whatever attempts at bridges seem to be more of a very self-conscious inclusion, attempts at inclusion. So how do you see it as this us and them will always be there, or would there really be a true global one family approach, really?
Well, you tell me. I mean,
I know it's a very idealistic approach that I'm talking about, but we do talk about it so much. We talk about us all being one big, great, big global family working for the earth and so on and so forth. But in reality, the ground reality is really so much of us and them, and there is that socio-historic background to it. Do you see those fissures mending? Do you see us really believing that we are together in this journey on Earth and Mars next?
I'm sorry to say that actually, as things get worse, what's become very clear is that, in fact, people are becoming much, much more tribal. You know, just look at the difference between the reception of Ukrainian refugees in Europe and what happened with the Syrian refugees, you know. There's such a huge difference. Similarly, if you look at the way that the US is now, I mean, this whole migration rhetoric has escalated there in relation to Mexico, even though for almost a decade now, there are more Mexicans leaving America than coming in. You know, it's kind of an absurdity, but you know, it's just a sort of tribalism, if you like. We've seen a lot of the same thing over here, and I'm afraid I think these fissures are only going to get worse. You know, as the planetary crisis intensifies, Sadly, I don't think people are going to are going to turn their anger upon the real causes, which is, like fossil fuels and certain patterns of industrialization. They're going to just vent it on minorities.
Okay, that's not a very happy note to end.
There's nothing happy in any of this, honestly.
So it's a little inappropriate of me to smile and thank you, but thank you so much, Amitav. May you continue writing wonderful books on troubling matters. And, thank you so much for doing this. It's my fault. I didn't realize this is the first event on this book. So for a photo op, you hold the English version, and there's simultaneously we have Mahaparvat, which is the Hindi translation of the book. So yes, the Hindi book is wonderful, and there are some words which are so natural in Hindi, I have to say, like the adept becomes Kalavati, which was very lovely, and the last lines are so beautiful. ये तुम्हें कुछ सिखाने की कोशिश करता रहा है और उससे तुमने कुछ भी नहीं सीखा, कुछ भी नहीं सीखा. I mean, those lines are, I have to say, the translator has done a wonderful job of the original. Both these books, as well as other titles of Amitav Ghosh, are available at the bookstore. You can buy it against your membership card and other ways. So once you've done that, he's happy to sign, and a brunch awaits those who've booked. Thank you so much, Amitav. Any final thoughts?
Well, thank you. It's so nice to do this here in Kolkata. So thank you all very much for coming.
Vote of thank will be given by Rudro Chatterjee on behalf of the Bengal Club.
Thank you, Maladi, and I, on behalf of the club, would request you to do more of these programs. These kind of programs make, as you can see from the number of members who have come today, 11:30 on a Sunday morning. These are the programs for which Bengal Club would turn up in maximum numbers. So I would request you to have these kind of programs. This discussion was fantastic, and all of you, whenever Mr. Amitav Ghosh comes, we would love to have you, speaking about the same or new books. These kind of conversations, sitting here in Kolkata, are rare, and we greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much for having it. The discussion on, what's happening to our planet, what's happening to the way we look at civilization. These conversations has been a theme of, several books, and we'd like to continue the conversation, and as a club maybe, get together, weave stories or create a movement, because it's not just, rational or scientific, solutions, but community solutions. And we'd love to work on these themes and have these discussions. Let's start this conversation, and thank you for coming and doing this today. Thank you. কোনটা মালা দিকে নাকি হ্যাঁ এটা